Sorry. Renee?
Yes,
Sorry,
Peter?
Renee. With respect to the grant for the men's shed, could you just say that it's from state government? Because I'm still trying to get clarity on whether it was from lotteries or gaming.
Sure, but I think Paul's starting the recording now. Sure. And Liz, are you going to start the recording? I already has, thank you. All right, everybody, welcome to our first Ordinary Council meeting for the town of Bassendean. Nyalak katit nija buja bal, wajak nunga buja nyalak nini. So in the language of the first people of this land, we know that we are gathered, not together, but we are gathered on wajak nunga land, always was and always will be. I might go straight down to the attendances just so that we're all clear who is here this evening. So if I could just go through everybody, and if you could just indicate your presence by turning on your microphone and your camera. So do we have Councillor Wilson in attendance?
Yes, Your Worship, I'm here.
Thank you. Councillor Quinton?
Yes, I'm here.
Councillor Barty?
Yes, I'm in attendance.
Councillor Hamilton?
Yes, I'm in attendance.
Councillor McWilliam?
Yes, I'm in attendance.
Thank you. And we have an apology this evening from Councillor Gangel, who's unable to be here. We also have a request from him that he submitted in writing before the meeting, requesting a leave of absence from today until the 1st of May. So I need to have a mover to accept that leave of absence. So can I please have a mover for that?
I'll move that.
Councillor Hamilton?
Councillor Wilson's happy to second.
Thank you, Councillor Wilson. Is there anyone against? Okay, that is carried unanimously. So as I said, tonight's the first time that we have met remotely via an e-meeting. Due to the COVID-19 pandemic, the relevant legislation was amended last week to allow councils to meet electronically. So in order to facilitate social distancing and to keep everyone safe, we'll be conducting our meetings remotely until further notice. It's probably going to take us a bit of time to get used to this while we all adapt and become proficient using the technology. And I thank everyone for your patience while we're all learning. And I also just want to take this opportunity to thank Liz Nichols and Matt Sabu for all their assistance over the last few days in getting everything set up at short notice. For members of the community, we really acknowledge that it's important for us to still create opportunities for people to be involved in the decisions that affect them. So for now, we are going to need members of the community to email us any of their questions or statements about any agenda items in advance of the meeting. And although there will no longer be a physical meeting location, we're encouraging members of our community to attend through the live stream feed or alternatively to access the recording that will be made available on our website after the meeting. So we will go on to item 2, which is public question time. We asked people to submit any questions by 3 p.m. this afternoon, and we received one question. Our CEO, Peter Mabbs, was going to respond to that question. Would you mind just outlining it for the benefit of councillors and those listening first, please?
Thank you, Renee. We did receive a question from Mr. Don Yates. The question related to with the active engagement of Development WA with higher density options for developers and landowners around the Bayswater transit-oriented development train station, what explanation can you give for growing conversations about similar engagement by Development WA that now incorporates Landcorp and the MRA around Ashfield, Bassendean and Success Hill Metronet train stations? And I can confirm that there have not been any discussions to date with Development WA in that regard. And there's a corresponding question that assumes there has been. Does this mean that Landcorp activities of 2014, 15 and 16 are revisiting Bassendean to fill the ongoing lack of planning outcomes of the last 4 years? So that question is not relevant given the former response. Thank you.
Thank you. There were no statements received from members of the public, but before we move on to the next item on the agenda, I just wanted to insert a new item here due to the fact that we're meeting electronically. So that is about suspension of a number of clauses from our standing orders local law that will not be relevant, seeing as we are not meeting in the council chambers as per usual. So I'll be asking for a mover and a seconder that council suspend the operation of clauses 6.8, 6.9, 6.10, 6.11, 6.12, 6.15 and 6.18 of the Bassendean Standing Orders Local Law 2011 for the duration of this electronic meeting, and that these matters be determined at the discretion of the presiding member. So I'm happy to move that. Is there a seconder for that motion?
Yes, I second. Councillor Quinton.
Thank you, Councillor Quinton. Is there anybody against? Okay, I will declare that carried. We don't have any deputations on tonight's agenda, so we'll move on to item 5, which is the confirmation of minutes. 5.1 is in relation to the general meeting of electors, which was held on the 10th of February. I need a mover for the officer recommendation for 5.1A is that the minutes of that meeting be received.
I'll move that motion.
Councillor Barty moved. Is there a seconder? I will second that motion.
Councillor Wilson.
Okay, seconded Councillor Wilson. Is there anybody against? So it's carried unanimously. 5.1B, that they're a true and accurate record. I'll move that motion. Is there a seconder?
Seconded, Councillor McWilliam.
Thank you, Councillor McWilliam. Anybody against? So that's carried unanimously. So moving on to 5.2, this is in relation to the ordinary council meeting that was held on the 25th of February this year. So the officer recommendation for item 5.2A is that the minutes of that meeting be received. I will move that. Is there a seconder?
Councillor Barty, I will second that motion.
Thank you, Councillor Barty. Is there anybody against? So that is carried unanimously. The officer recommendation for 5.2B that the minutes are confirmed as a true record. I'll move that motion. Is there a seconder?
Councillor Barty, I'll second that motion.
Thank you, Councillor Barty. Is there anybody against? So that is carried unanimously. One final lot of minutes. 5.3 is the special council meeting held last week on the 24th of March. Officer recommendation for 5.3A is that the minutes be received. I will move that. Is there a seconder?
Yes, I second that. Councillor Quinton.
Thank you, Councillor Quinton. Anybody against? That is carried unanimously. And 5.3B, that the minutes be confirmed as a true record. I'll move that motion.
Yes,
Is there a seconder? Thank you, Councillor Quinton. Is there anybody against? That is carried unanimously. Thank you, everyone. So moving on to item 6, these are the announcements. So I'd just like to speak a little bit about the coronavirus and our response to the COVID-19 pandemic. So as everyone would be aware, like the rest of the world, our community in Bassendean is facing the threat of the COVID-19 pandemic. And we recognise the significant impact that it's already having on our community. The increased levels of unemployment that we're seeing, that many of our local businesses are being forced to close their doors, and that there are many people who are struggling financially, as well as the impact that it's having on people's mental and physical health. But we also know that we have an amazing community here in Bassendean, and we're known for our amazing community spirit, and our strength is in coming together to support one another, and we'll get through this by working together. So just to outline some of the things that we're currently doing in response. So in order to keep everyone safe, we've made some changes to the town services. So essential services such as waste collection will continue, but all of our events and programs have been cancelled, including the markets. Our customer service and the library have been closed, but they remain accessible to our community by phone, email or online. We've suspended all the bookings and provided a full refund to cancelled bookings for town facilities. Our youth drop-in centre and the ride driver education program are currently closed, as are our playgrounds, exercise equipment and the skate park. and public drinking fountains will have their water supply disconnected. We are continuing to provide in-home services to many seniors in our town, and we've seen a surge in referrals to this service over the last couple of weeks. Our Wind in the Willows Childcare Centre continues to provide services for our town's families, many of whom are still required to be at work. This week we launched our Neighbour Assist program. So Neighbour Assist includes a helpline which provides information, support, referral or practical assistance to people in our community. So we encourage everyone to spread the word so that those in our community who are vulnerable and isolated can stay at home and stay connected and hopefully stay safe. At our special council meeting last week, council asked our CEO to prepare a budget for the coming financial year that was based on a 0% rate revenue increase, including no increase to our fees and charges. The staff are also in the process of drafting a hardship policy, recognising the significant impacts that the pandemic is having on households, businesses and groups that lease the town's assets. It's been really encouraging to see our community come together to support one another. I think we all recognise that we live in a really fantastic place where people do come together to support each other. And I encourage everyone to continue to work together to make some temporary changes in our own lives and to look after one another to minimise the impacts on our community, our friends, our families, our co-workers and our neighbours. So I hope everyone can stay home as much as possible, stay connected and stay safe. And in good news, the town today was informed that we were successful in obtaining a $137,000 grant from the state government for the men's shed. So a big thanks to Greg Nerry for his efforts with this grant application. So that's it for announcements. So we'll move on to petitions, which there are none. Declarations of interest. I've had two councillors indicate that they have interest. So Councillor Wilson for item 10.5, an impartiality interest, and 13.1, a financial interest from Councillor Quinton. Are there any other declarations of interest from councillors?
No, Your Worship. Do you want me to explain the nature of my impartiality interest?
That would be wonderful. Thank you, Councillor Wilson.
So in relation to item 10.5, for those listening at home, it relates to the Animals, Environment, Nuisance and Pest local laws. I am a known and avid lover of chickens, and it may cloud my judgment. So I would like other councillors to take this into account when they're listening to my contributions to that item.
Thank you, Councillor Wilson. Councillor Quinton, did you wish to speak to yours?
Yes, thank you. My partner is a coach of the Galaxy Football Association, so he would have a direct benefit to the community and sponsorship grant should it be successful tonight.
Thank you. And were there any other declarations? Okay, in that case, can I just remind Councillor Quinton and Councillor Wilson to provide in writing to the CEO their declaration of interest for those items. So item 9 is business deferred, of which we have none. So we'll move on to item 10, which is the reports. So I'll go through the list of items that I currently have for coming out of en bloc. So 10.2, which is the disposal of Morley Drive East, Lot 5. 10.3, the local planning policy number 17. 10.4, the draft local planning policy relating to tree retention. 10.5, animals, environment, nuisance and pests local law. 10.6, the waste local law. 10.7, the swimming pool and spa safety inspections. 10.8, the single-use plastics and balloons policy. 10.9, the draft verge treatment policy. 10.11, the RFT for plumbing and gas services. 10.12, the RFT for Whitfield Safe Active Street construction. 11.1 and 11.2 have been withdrawn. 11.3, notice of motion from myself. 11.4, notice of motion from Councillor Wilson. 13.1 and 13.2. Are there any other items councillors would like taken out of en bloc?
Sorry, I missed it. Did you take 10.15 out?
No, but I had it highlighted as a possibility, yes.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Hamilton. Any others? Okay, in that case, I will move for the remainder to be carried on block. Is there a seconder?
I'll second that.
Thank you, Councillor Hamilton. Is there anybody against? Okay, that is carried unanimously. So we'll move on to item 10.2. This is the disposal of lot 5, 246 Morley Drive East in Eden Hill. Are there any questions for our staff on this item? Okay, Councillor Hamilton.
Actually, sorry, Your Worship, Councillor Wilson here.
Can you turn your camera on? That makes. Sorry, Councillor Wilson. When you speak, just turn your camera on so I can see who's talking a bit more easily.
There we go.
Thank you.
Sorry, I do have a question, Your Worship. It relates to an exchange of correspondence that's happened between staff that I just think would be useful to put on the public record. And it relates to the flow of monies should this item be endorsed hypothetically, and should a sale proceed, how the money would flow from the purchaser through the various accounts of council.
Thank you. Mrs. Mabs, would you like to respond to that, or would you like Mr. White to do so?
I'd be happy to respond to that. My conversation with Councillor Wilson this afternoon related to the fact that should the sale proceed, the $1 million would go into the municipal funds account, and from there it would make its way to the Land and Building Infrastructure Reserve. The discussion with Councillor Wilson was one of transparency and ensuring our community understood and appreciated where those funds would end up. And if that's something that Council would like to solidify through a resolution, that could be forthcoming.
Thank you. Does that answer your question, Councillor Wilson?
Yes, thank you, Your Worship, it does. And thank you to the CEO for her attendance to that request earlier today.
Thank you. Councillor Hamilton, you had a question?
Just wanted to, the CEO mentioned $1 million. The first page of the contract of sale is actually 1 million plus GST. So just wanted to confirm that that was the intent of the officer's recommendation, that it was plus GST.
That's correct, and that's what's been outlined in the contract of sale. That's the understanding between the parties.
Okay, are there any further questions?
Also, Madam Mayor, because I have very bad voice, I think Councillor Wilson was going to move the alternative or...
So the amended motion? Okay, do all councillors have a copy of the amendment that was being proposed? So, Councillor Wilson, would you like to read out what you're proposing? Actually, before we do this, are you moving the motion with this amendment that you're proposing?
Yeah, I'm going to move that constitutes an alternative motion, or is just moving the recommendation with an additional point. Happy to take guidance.
I would imagine it is just an amendment. It doesn't seem to substantially change the motion. Would you agree, Ms. Mabs?
That's correct. That's correct. I think what it does, it clarifies, crystallises the situation, and if that assists in transparency, it's a good thing.
Okay. So Councillor Wilson would like to move the officer recommendation with an additional point. Would you mind just turning your microphone off, Peter? Thank you. So Councillor Wilson, could you please read out the second point that you would like to add to the officer recommendation?
Thank you, Your Worship. So it would be point 1 and then the addition of a new point 2. And that new point 2 would read, all monies resulting from the sale of 246, brackets lot 5, close brackets, Morley Drive East, Eden Hill, be held in the Land and Buildings Infrastructure Reserve until Council determines specific allocations during the upcoming 2020-21 budget process.
Thank you. Do we have a seconder for that motion?
I'm happy to second the motion.
Thank you, Councillor Barty. Amy, I just wanted to check in with you as the minute taker. The proposed amendment has been included in the chat, if you're able to access that. I guess we've got a mover and a seconder for the officer recommendation with an amended second point. Is there anybody against this motion?
With your indulgence, I would like to speak briefly to it, if that's okay.
That is quite all right. You may speak now, Councillor Wilson.
Thank you, Worship. So just for the record, I'd like to make it clear that I have received and read in detail all of the submissions that have been put forward, both in support and against this proposed sale. I've also corresponded with the representatives of some of the parties who have made submissions, just to make it clear that their views were taken into account when I formed my position on this, and as a result, am still happy to move.
Thank you. Okay, I will then, let's go back to, is there anybody against this motion? Okay, so we will declare that carried unanimously. Thank you, everybody. So item 10.3, which is the local planning policy number 17, grade separation at the corner of Guildford Road and Old Perth Road. This is a revocation motion. Are there any questions that people would like to ask on this item? Okay, in that case, I'm happy to move the officer recommendation. Is there a seconder for the officer recommendation?
I'll second the officer's recommendation, Your Worship.
Thank you, Councillor Barty. Is there anybody against? Okay, so that...
May I ask a question, Madam Mayor?
You may ask a question, Councillor Hamilton.
Revocation motion, does it not need 3, not 2 councillors?
Well, that is a good point. So would you like to be the third person, Councillor Hamilton?
Yes, that's fine.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that. So in that case, is there anybody against? Okay, so that is carried unanimously by an absolute majority. 10.4, this is the draft local planning policy number 13 relating to tree retention and provision. Questions for our staff to begin with? I have a question for Mr. Wilson. I sent through an email today, but just for clarification for some of the other councillors who may not have received the response, I was querying the clauses 6.2 A and C, which is where it's specified that at least one medium tree for every 350 metres square and a minimum of 1 tree per lot. And clause C, which is the number of trees required may be reduced by 2, where a tree subject to a tree preservation order or a medium or large tree is retained. And my query today was around whether or not staff thought these were strong enough to incentivise tree retention. Mr. Gibson?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Yes, as discussed the other day, staff have tried to strike a balance between what is reasonable an incentive, as well as what is reasonable to effectively burden a developer with as part of a blank site. If we to further incentivise the retention of trees, we would have had to do one of a number of things. That would have been to either provide even greater dispensation for the retention of existing trees, or to require greater provision of new trees as part of a new development. Staff worked through various situations and talked with other local governments that had similar policies, and we've decided that what we proposed in the current draft does strike the right balance between the two considerations.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? Okay, is there anybody who'd like to move the officer recommendation?
Yes, I'm happy to move. Councillor
Quinton, thank you. And a seconder?
Yes, Councillor Wilson here. I'm happy to second.
Okay, I think I just seconded it before you. So Councillor Quinton moved, Councillor McLennan seconded. Is there anybody against? Okay, so that is carried unanimously. So moving on to item 10.5. Before we do, can we just check that all of our councillors are still able to hear everything that's going on? So we just heard from Councillor Wilson and Councillor Quinton. Councillor Barty, are you still connected?
Still connected, Your Worship.
Councillor Hamilton?
Still here.
And Councillor McWilliam?
Still here.
Okay, thank you. So item 10.5, this is the Animals, Environment, Nuisance and Pests Local Law. Questions to begin with?
Yes, thank you, Your Worship. I have some questions.
Can we hear your questions?
Yeah, sorry, I was just pressing send on the email for the CEO for my declaration of interest relating to impartiality, and preface these questions with the reminder that I'm an avid chicken lover. So going to the attachments to the agenda, I take Councillors' attention to 2.7 and 2.8 of the proposed local law. Just give us a minute to open that up. So it's attachment 4. Oh no, sorry, that's
6, I think.
Attachment 6 now. Sections 2.7 and 2.8. 2.7 refers to the limitation on the numbers of poultry, pigeons and caged birds, and 0.8 related conditions for poultry in limited numbers. So my questions just relate in and around those two areas. During the briefing, there was some discussion about 2.81E, and 2.81E of the proposed local law says the enclosures have an otherwise unobstructed area of at least 20 square metres. And a plain reading of that says that an enclosure would be 20 square metres whether you had chicken or whether you had 12. So my question is, do staff believe that it is necessary, or do staff believe that there is a legal requirement that an enclosure must be 20 square metres for 1 chicken or 12 chickens?
So if we could direct that question to Mr. Gibson, thank you.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I suppose the purpose of the local law is to set that standard. So if council was to adopt the local law as drafted and as contained as the attachment, that would be the implication. It would be a minimum of 20 square metres, be it for 1 chicken or 12 chickens. It would be open to council, as has been suggested previously, to amend that provision to make it a square metre rate per bird. Advice we've received today would suggest that is not a significant change to the local law and could be progressed by council if they so chose.
Thank you. Councillor Wilson?
Okay, thank you for that answer. So I'll just foreshadow then that it would be my intention to move an amendment then to that 2.81E. The other question that I had was in relation to the distances of a chicken enclosure from a wall or a fence. Do the staff have any views, or are the staff aware of any legal requirements that would prevent council from deciding to put or to allow residents to put an enclosure along a boundary wall or a fence if that was a solid fence that was dug into the ground?
Mr. Wilson?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Again, the local law would be setting the standard for what can and cannot be done in terms of the keeping of chickens. The 1.2 metre setback is there broadly to manage waste penetration into the soil and the hosing off of the area. If chickens were allowed up until the boundary and it was hosed off, there may be seepage into the neighbouring property and the associated pest and odour concerns that come with that. Again, it would be open to council to accept a lesser distance or no distance at all. I do note, though, that the local law as currently drafted already provides an ability for council to consider variations to the prescribed standards, which would be considered on a case-by-case basis. And would have regard to the type of fencing that exists and obviously the views of the abutting neighbour. But in terms of the underlying question of whether it is open to council to change the distance, it is.
Thank you. I just had a query about that because in a response that I received today, I was given the impression that at the moment, any complaints that we're receiving about people who are currently keeping chickens are generally related to them that have non-compliant ones against adjoining fences, and the problems that you're referring to have been raised by neighbouring properties. Is that correct?
Through you, Madam Mayor, yeah, apart from the keeping of roosters, which is an occasional complaint, the other frequent complaint is where chickens are kept up to and abutting a site boundary. That's what generates most of the complaints.
Thank you, and my apologies for calling you Luke Wilson instead of Luke Gibson. Thank you for being understanding. Councillor Quinton, you had a question?
Yeah, I do. I have an administrative question about the passage of the local law, which might be best directed to the CEO. If at this stage we make changes to the draft, does it need to go back out for community consultation?
Ms. Mabs?
Thank you. It would depend upon the extent of the changes. If they're deemed to be minor, that shouldn't be an issue. However, if they are significant, it could be that we need to start the process again that was commenced about 12 months ago.
Thank you. Sorry, just a moment. Do you mind turning your microphone off, Peter, for a moment? So, Mr. Gibson, you indicated a few minutes ago that the initial proposal from Councillor Wilson was regarding the square meterage was a minor change. Would a change to the boundary setbacks be also considered a minor change, or would that be a more significant one?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Whilst it's probably more significant than changing
Hello, Luke's frozen for me.
Luke is also frozen for me. Luke, do we have you back? Mr. Gibson?
Yes, thank you, Madam Mayor. Sorry about that.
So would you mind repeating that answer because you froze for a while?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Yeah, the advice we've received from WALGA suggested that those sorts of detailed changes don't fundamentally change the intent of the local law and could well be considered via an amendment from councillors. But I suppose that would still need to be tested. We couldn't say definitively what change would be considered significant and what would be considered insignificant. But the advice we received this afternoon would suggest, for what it's worth, that minor changes of detail could be tolerated.
Thank you. Councillor Quinton, you had a question?
It was just a follow-up question. What deems it significant or not? But I guess so what is the process here? Is that it goes back to this is not the Joint Standing Committee one, is it? Where does it go back to deem that it's significant or not?
Okay, thank you. Mr. Gibson?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. If I could, it may be more appropriate that Elizabeth fields that question.
Thank you. Elizabeth, are you able to give us some insights?
Yes, Your Worship. Council determines if it's at this stage to make it, if they consider it to be insignificant or a significant amendment, and then it goes through as if it was a made local law and you adopt it, and then it goes on. And as it stands, once it goes back to the minister and we've gazetted it, they may actually take exception to it or not. So that's where we're at.
Okay, thank you. Does that answer your question, Councillor Quinton?
Yes, thank you.
Are there any further questions? Okay, so we have an officer recommendation. We also have Councillor Wilson flagging that he would like to propose and some amendments. Councillor Wilson, would you like to let people know what amendments you are likely to propose?
Thank you, Your Worship. So I'll start with the intention. So the intention is that I propose we make two minor changes to the local law. The first minor change is at 2.81E. So where it currently reads, the enclosures have an otherwise unobstructed area of at least 20 square metres. What I propose to do is to amend the 20 square metres and replace that with 2 metres square per chicken. The intention being that the size of the enclosure will be variable depending on how many chickens a person wants to keep, up to the maximum of 12, which is specified elsewhere. The second minor change that I would seek to get other councillors' support to make is to say that the requirement at 2.81C that an enclosure not be closer than 1.2 metres to any property boundary be altered so that it reads instead, all poultry are to be kept in an enclosure within which is a properly constructed weatherproof structure for roosting, so that we would remove the words not closer than 1.2 metres to any property boundary.
Okay, thank you very much. Mr. Gibson, can I please ask you to comment on those two separately? So I think you indicated earlier the first one at 2.81E related to the square meterage of an enclosure. You seem to indicate that that would be supported by staff. Is that correct?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. In terms of the 20 square metre element, I suppose staff's view is that the greater the area, the better. The larger the area that is being used for the keeping of chickens, the greater the ability of the soil to effectively capture runoff and chicken output, we'll call it. So staff certainly favour a more generous provision of space per chicken, accepting, of course, that having a flat ratio doesn't account necessarily for a variable number of chickens, but as a general principle, staff would prefer to see more land per bird rather than less, but it's obviously open to council to pick whatever that per square metre rate is. 2 square metres would be the absolute minimum, I think, that would be appropriate, and it may well be appropriate to have a greater area allocation than that, keeping in mind that it's always open for someone to apply to council to vary the standards on a case-by-case basis. In terms of the setback element, staff, I suppose, through experience have observed that the majority of complaints about the keeping of chickens is typically where birds are allowed to exist up against the boundary, and the washing out of those areas can have an impact on the neighbouring property through the seepage of wastewater and odour. Again, staff would take the view that a 1.2 metre setback as a starting point is appropriate, keeping in mind that, again, there is a provision that enables anyone to come to the town and council to seek a reduction in that setback distance if the birds are managed appropriately and if there is support from the neighbouring landowner.
Thank you. Are there any questions from councillors?
Thank you, Your Worship. I have a follow-up question for Mr. Gibson.
Yes.
Okay. So I take Mr. Gibson's point that the majority of complaints relate to chickens that are kept on a property boundary. But in relation to 2.81C2, we have the wording there, have an impervious floor. And my question is, how could there be seepage if the floor was impervious?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. The impervious floor would typically be, or would often be, concrete slabs, and the hosing off and the hosing out of an area has, as observed by our health officers over a number of years, generally been the source of the angst between neighbours, on the basis that the water can sometimes run into a timber fence and be absorbed, or in the case of a colour-bond fence, and can actually run underneath the fence. So whilst there needs to be a impervious floor, that doesn't in of itself stop water runoff into the neighbouring property.
Thank you. Just another follow-up question. Then I take councillors' attention to 2.814, where it says that the structure must also have walls constructed of an impervious material. So if the floor is impervious and the walls are impervious, how then would it be possible for water to escape the enclosure?
Mr. Gibson, are you happy to address that?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Certainly take the point offered by Councillor Wilson, but I suppose, the observation still is that is the key source of complaint in terms of the keeping of birds on residential properties. Like I said before, it would certainly be open to council to adopt a lesser distance. However, it would need to consider whether that's appropriate in a residential setting, and whether that would simply be creating more issues for neighbours to complain about. But in terms of whether it can statutorily be done, that's certainly open to council.
Thank you. Did you have any further questions, Councillor Wilson?
No, not at this stage. I'm happy to address those in debate.
Okay, Councillor Quinton?
Yes, thank you. I just, I'm wondering if there isn't a contradiction between 2.81C1 to allow a minimum of 30 centimetres of floor per thou and the 2 metres per thou. There seems to be now two spatial requirements that contradict each other. One is 0.3 of a square metre and one is 2 square metres. So which would we follow?
I'm happy to address that.
Yeah.
Hold on a moment. So, Councillor Quinton, you're referring to the 2.81C1, referring to the roosting area, I think, and then E, which is the total enclosure area. Is that what you're referring to?
Thank you. That might be the difference. I'm not a chicken owner, so I don't know the technical terms.
Councillor Wilson, yeah, okay. Councillor Wilson, could you turn your microphone off? Are there questions from any other councillors? Okay, in that case, we have an officer recommendation. We also have had a councillor flag their intention to move an amended recommendation. So would somebody like to move either of those options or something else?
Yes, Your Worship, I would like to move the amended version.
So I don't think we have exact words on your amended version. So could you maybe give us some specifics, please?
Certainly. May it please, Your Worship?
Sorry, before you continue, could you make sure you type them into the chat as well, please?
Certainly I will. May it please, Your Worship, I intend to address first the wording in the proposed local law.
Mm-hmm.
And so the two changes that I'd seek to make, the first change is at 2.81C, and at 2.81C to delete the words after enclosure and before within. So the words not closer than 1.2 metres to any property boundary would be deleted, and it would read instead, all poultry are kept in an enclosure within which is a properly constructed weatherproof structure for roosting, etc.
Okay, Councillor Quinton has a question.
Yeah, sorry, someone can apply to have an exemption on that clause, can't they?
That is correct. So people can apply to have something that is not compliant with the local law and would be assessed on an individual basis. Is that correct, Mr. Gibson?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Yes, that's correct.
Thank you. So, Councillor Wilson, that's the first point. And the second point?
And so the second point would be at 2.81E, and it is to replace 20 square metres with 2 metres square per bird or poultry. What are we saying? Poultry, yes.
Thank you. Councillor Quinton?
Are these going to be dealt with separately or together?
I'm happy to have them dealt with separately if Council prefers to proceed that way.
So how about we then have someone move the officer recommendation and then we can debate each of the proposed amendments individually.
I'm happy to move, subject to, yes, those two things being debated.
Okay, so Councillor Wilson, are you happy with that?
I would like to have a right of reply. I've already moved the motion, so no, I'd prefer to keep my ability to have a right of reply if that's okay.
So you'd like to move the officer recommendation with those 2 points as outlined?
and have them debated and voted on separately, if that's okay with you.
Okay, so just so we're all clear, at the moment we have got the Oxford recommendation with 2 changes. The proposed changes are to delete the words not closer than 1.2 metres from 2.81C, and also at 2.81E to replace 20 square metres with 2 square metres per bird. So we need to have a seconder to be able to debate these 2 items. Is there a seconder at this stage?
I'm happy to second.
Councillor Quinton's happy to second. All right. Is there anybody against these amendments?
Sorry, now I'm confused because I'm for one, but I'm against another. So which one have I seconded?
You can second it and still be against it. That's fine.
Okay.
Okay. So Councillor Wilson, would you like to open debate on the first amendment? So this is relating to deleting the not closer than 1.2 metres from the clause.
Thank you, Worship. Yes, I take the point that Mr Gibson made about there being a source of angst between neighbours for poultry that are kept against a fence. I would suggest, however, that source of angst comes from chickens who are kept free range and are not in an impervious enclosure. So, for example, I'm aware of a neighbour who has some chicken wire up against a fence. That fence is a colour-bond fence, so there's a gap underneath it. And yes, in that circumstance, I agree it would be a problem. In that circumstance, I agree that bugs and whatnot could get under the fence, and if there was washing going on, it could wash underneath the fence. And so I do not think that we should allow for that. But I would ask councillors to consider very carefully the words impervious that are put in 2.81C2 and 2.81 C4, which say that the floor and the walls have to be impervious. And it is my belief that if the floor and the walls are impervious, then it is impossible for muck to leave the chicken area and get to the other side of the neighbour's fence. The reason I want to remove the restriction to make it 1.2 metres off the fence is because if we have a 1.2 metre rule, it really limits the ability of some people to keep chickens in our community. If you live on a quarter-acre block, then it's very easy to comply with these requirements. And I have some friends who keep chickens who have the luxury of living on a quarter-acre block, and they have a very large enclosure and it's all of the adequate metres away from the fence. But in the future, less and less people in our community will be able to live on a quarter-acre block. I think certainly in the troubled times that we're in, there is a push for more and more people towards food self-sufficiency. There is a push for more and more people to want to be able to keep chickens as a food source. And I think that as a council, we should be removing any barriers we can to people being able to keep chickens, so long as they're keeping those chickens in a safe and sanitary way. And I think if somebody lived in a subdivided block and they had a 2 metre gap between their house and their neighbouring property, if we did not remove this requirement, we would be preventing them from being able to keep chickens. And I don't think that is in keeping with our community expectations. The other point that I would make is that if we rely on people having to come and make individual applications, that will create a very large administrative burden for our staff. It would also create an administrative burden for council if we had to subsequently approve that. And it would be contrary to the approach that we took to the verge treatments, for example, recently, where we said that as long as people were acting within reasonable guidelines, we would let them have the ability to be creative and to use their verges how they wanted without having to come for individual application. And I think it would be good practice for us to be consistent in that regard in our treatment with chickens to make it easier for people to keep chickens, as long as they're doing so in a sanitary way, on the small blocks that people live on these days, and without having to come and make an individual application and deal with staff and take up staff time. If somebody doesn't meet these requirements, if they keep chickens in an unsanitary way, neighbours would still be able to complain, and if their enclosures were not impervious, then there would be an ability for staff to deal with that on the basis that muck was escaping from the enclosure. So for all of those reasons, I would strongly urge councillors to support the idea that we can remove the requirement to be off the property boundaries so that more people can keep chickens in a safe way.
Thank you, Councillor Wilson. We just had a question from Councillor Barty in the chat asking about whether under the definitions at 1.5 of the local law, whether there could be a definition of impervious. Mr. Gibson?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Yes, that section is dealing with the definitions as used in the local law. It would be open to council again to amend the draft local law to add a definition. Given that did not form part of the advertised draft, there would be the risk that that introduces an element that might be considered a significant change. I suppose in terms of if this amended staff resolution is successful, I think there would be a common understanding of what impervious means, and even if it's not contained within the local law, we would default to a dictionary definition.
Yeah, thank you. And just to pick up Councillor Barty's point, so one of the principles for statutory interpretation, as Mr. Gibson has said, is that the common dictionary definition of a word is taken to be incorporated into the legislation, and so for the purposes of this, that would mean not allowing fluid to pass through. So the structure would have to be watertight. So if there was any washing to happen, no water could escape from the structure to even touch the fence, let alone cross over the fence.
Okay, noted. Thank you.
Councillor Quinton, did you have a question?
Yes, thank you. I did note in section 2.91C, there is also the requirement for pigeon lofts to be located within 1.2 metres of the boundary of an adjoining property. So I think this would raise confusion for people between having any kind of birds. So if we're to change one, we should change the other. My concern is that this would risk us, the law not being passed by the Minister because there's too many significant changes.
I'm not sure whether that was a question or just a comment. Did you have anything in response to that, Mr. Gibson? Or, sorry, it may even be directed towards Libby.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. It would not be incumbent on council necessarily to amend 2.91C simply because it chooses to amend a different provision regarding chickens. It's not obliged to amend a similar provision regarding pigeons. It would be open to council to do so, but the risk would be, as Councillor Quinton identifies, that the changes start mounting up and the local law is potentially disallowed. But essentially there is no obligation on council to change 2.91C.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Gibson. And just in relation to Councillor Quinton's point, which is well made, I would point out that there are already significant differences between the requirements for keeping poultry and the requirements for keeping pigeons. So I would take councillors' attention to the existing draft version, which does not require that a pigeon loft have impervious floor or impervious walls. So those differences already exist, and I would not propose that a pigeon loft be changed from the definition that's already been circulated, but for other reasons would propose that chickens, if kept in an impervious enclosure, can be and should be allowed to be on a property boundary.
Okay, Councillor Wilson, I'm going to ask you to stop and you'll have the opportunity to say them in your right of reply. Councillor Quinton, you had seconded this. Did you wish to speak to the motion?
Yes, thank you. This is, I guess, the nature of the complaints are really at the crux of this question about whether we remove the 1.2 metre requirement, because while there is now the safeguard that there would be an impervious floor and wall, it might not necessarily be about leakage. It might also just be about noise and other pests that emanate, the ability for vegetation to grow between that 1.2 metres that could minimise that. I'm satisfied that if someone can prove to the council that they have an impervious floor and wall that is abutted to the adjoining property, that application would be approved by council with the agreement by their neighbour, because at the end of the day, keeping chickens should be something that you do with your neighbour, because as Councillor Wilson pointed out, we are having smaller backyards, and neighbour feuds are the thing that at the end of the day could mean no one has chickens. So I would recommend that we keep the 1.2 metres, and I don't think that anyone who makes a complaint at this stage is going to have any major increase to the administrative burden to have that approved. So I would recommend keeping it in.
Thank you, Councillor Quinton. Is there a speaker for the motion? Is there a speaker against the motion? Okay, so we'll put that to the vote. So we're voting on whether or not to delete the words not closer than 1.2. Oh, sorry. Councillor Wilson, you wanted to speak again?
Thank you, Your Worship. Just briefly, in my right to reply, I completely understand the concerns that Councillor Quinton has about not wanting to create tension between neighbours, and I completely understand the concerns neighbours might have about sanitation and cleanliness. But I think that read in total, with all of the other requirements, it would not be possible to create nuisance if people were complying with all of the other requirements. And I would just ask councillors to consider the way we voted and the approach that we took to the verges, where we wanted to give people freedom to act without administrative burden and regulation and micromanagement by council. And I would plead you all to continue to be consistent in that application with this matter.
Thank you, Councillor Wilson. Okay, so I'm going to go through and ask each of you to give me a for or against. So Councillor Wilson, you are for?
That is correct, yes.
Councillor Quinton?
Against.
Councillor Barty?
For.
Councillor Hamilton?
Against.
Councillor McWilliam?
For.
For. So it doesn't matter what I do really, because at the moment, even if I'm against, hold on, if I'm for, so I am also against, which means it is 3-all and we require an absolute majority. So that is lost. We will now move on to the second part, which is in relation to replacing 20 square metres with 2 square metres per bird. Are there any questions for councillors on this before we move on to the actual debate and voting? Councillor Quinton?
Yes, just doing the simple maths, that if there's a maximum of 12 birds at 2 square metres each, would the minimum requirement still be 20 square metres or is it 24 square metres?
Mr Gibson?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Under Councillor Wilson's motion, it would be simply a per bird calculation. In that case, if someone had the full complement of 12 birds, they would be required to provide 24 square metres.
Thank you. Other questions?
Yes, Madam Mayor. Just a question for Councillor Wilson. Mr Gibson indicated earlier that 2 square metres would be the bare minimum for safe chicken keeping. Are you satisfied that 2 square metres would be sufficient to ensure that the poultry are well cared for?
Councillor Wilson? He can probably address that in his debate in a moment. I think Councillor Barty. Are you there, Councillor Wilson?
Hello, I am, yes.
Okay.
I'm happy to point out at this point, though, that the Australian Eggs Association, which sets the Australian standard for what constitutes free range, requires that there must be 1 square metre per hen. So what I'm proposing is, in fact, double the Australian standard for the definition of free range.
Thank you, Councillor Wilson. Are there other questions? Councillor William?
Sorry, I don't actually have a question. I'm just listening. I think that you'll find that if it was at 20 square metres instead of 24 as the minimum, that there would still be sufficient room for the chickens, because they do tend to nest together and then move around into other areas to pick at food, etc. So I think it's probably that's a significantly large area that we're looking at when we're talking about 20 square metres. That's a fairly big chicken coop. 24 square metres makes it even bigger again. We've got a sort of a limit on the number of chickens at 12. Maybe we should drop it down to 10 just to keep the peace.
Okay, so Councillor, I don't think you had a question there. I think you were maybe proposing another.
Well, maybe I can say, can we consider 10 as the minimum, 10 chickens as the minimum, as the maximum, sorry, so that 20 square metres is retained? Just is that a way forward?
That would be a possibility for council to consider if so wished, but at the moment we have the proposal from Councillor Wilson for 2 square metres per chicken. There wasn't a proposal to increase or change the number of birds that were permitted. Is that correct, Councillor Wilson?
It is, and I think the reason why I'm happy for it just to be a 2 square metres per chicken is that I think it's highly unlikely that somebody would have or need 12 chickens given the number of eggs they would produce. And if they were to have 12 chickens, well, then they would need the room for the 24 square metres. I'm comfortable that it would be an outlier situation which people would be able to apply for an exemption for in those rare circumstances.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Wilson. Are there any other questions?
Yes, one from me again, Your Worship.
Yes, Councillor William.
Who will be maintaining a tally on the number of chickens any particular owner has at any time?
Maybe Councillor Gibson, are you able to address the question?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I'm not a councillor. I'm a mere employee. the health services branch would be the ones considering any applications lodged by landowners. It's important to note, though, we wouldn't keep a record of everyone keeping chickens, only those that would be approaching the town looking for a permit under the local law.
Thank you.
Thank you. Apologies again, Mr. Gibson. Because I can't see you all, I'm getting a little bit less feedback. Okay, any further questions? All right, so we've had Councillor Wilson move this second amendment. So the amendment is to replace the 20 square metres with 2 metres square per bird. Councillor Quinton has seconded it. Councillor Wilson, would you like to speak to your motion?
Thank you, Worship. Just briefly, I think most of the issues have already been ventilated. If somebody wants to keep 2 chickens, under this proposal, they would only need a modest 4 metre square enclosure, which would be achievable even for someone with a small household space. And I think that having that flexibility to scale the size of an enclosure to the number of chickens somebody wishes to keep would create flexibilities that encourage chicken ownership in our community, and would encourage other councillors to support this change. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Wilson. Councillor Quinton, would you like to speak to the motion?
Yes, thank you. This makes absolute sense to change this clause in the local law. As Councillor Wilson said in the previous amendment, we are having far more density. There is less room for people. I think the latest pandemic has highlighted a need for people to be growing and securing their own food. And I think this is something that would make absolute sense for us. I also think that given it makes sense for us to change it, it will also make sense for the Minister to approve the local law, given that there has been an amendment. So this would be a safe amendment for us to make at this stage. So thank you, Councillor Wilson. I totally agree.
Thank you, Councillor Quinton. Are there any speakers against the motion? For the motion? Councillor Wilson, is there anything more you wish to add? Okay, so we'll put that to the vote. So Councillor Wilson is for the motion. Councillor Quinton? For the motion. Councillor Barty?
For.
Councillor Hamilton?
For.
Councillor McWilliam?
For.
And I'm for the motion, so that is carried. And now we just need to go back to the main motion. Councillor Wilson's moved, Councillor Quinton has seconded. Is there anybody against?
So we just might need to amend the wording of the officer recommendation to include words to the effect to say the local law as amended, or the local law incorporating the change at 2.81
C.
E for Edward. Yep.
Yep. Ms. Holmes, are you comfortable that you've got that?
Yep, I can word that appropriately to make the amendment to that 2.81E and make a note of that in the recommendation.
Great, thank you. Okay, so is there any councillor against the motion? Okay, that is carried unanimously by an absolute majority. Thank you, everybody. 10.6, it's the adoption of the waste local law. Any questions to begin with? So Amy, you may have noticed that Councillor Quinton's just notified you that she's left the room. Okay, so if there's no questions on this item, do we have a mover for the officer recommendation?
Madam Mayor.
Yes, Councillor Hamilton.
Sorry, I thought you could see my image. May I ask if I can leave the meeting for the rest of the evening? This is for the...
Yes. Would you mind waiting until Councillor Quinton returns so that we don't have 4 councillors left?
Yep.
Thank you. Okay, so do we have a mover for the waste local law?
Councillor Wilson, I'm happy to move.
Councillor Wilson, and a seconder?
Happy to second, Your Worship.
Thank you, Councillor Barty. Is there anybody against? Okay, and that is carried unanimously by an absolute majority. Item 10.7, this is the swimming pool and spa safety inspections. I believe, Councillor Barty, you were intending to propose a deferral of this item, is that correct?
Yes, Your Worship. In light of the fact that the contractor is not willing or able to conduct the inspections at this time due to the COVID-19 pandemic, and also in light of the fact that members of our community are currently experiencing financial duress without bias, regardless whether or not they have a swimming pool, I felt it appropriate to defer this motion at this time.
Thank you. I'm happy to second the deferral. Is there anybody against? Okay, so that is carried unanimously to defer for future consideration at budget time. 10.8 is the draft single-use plastics and balloon policy. Any questions to begin with? So I would like to thank Mr. Bryce Campbell, who made some amendments updating the policy to reflect feedback from the briefing session. So those changes have been made. So Councillor Quinton is back. Councillor Hamilton, did you wish to leave the meeting now?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. So Councillor Hamilton is leaving the meeting and will not be returning for the remainder of the evening. So do we have a move, or I'll move the officer recommendation for 10.8. Is there a seconder?
Happy to second, Your Worship.
Thank you, Councillor Barty. Is there anybody against? Okay, so that is carried unanimously by an absolute majority. So 10.9, the draft verge treatment policy. Any questions for staff?
Yes, Your Worship. Councillor Wilson here, I have a question.
Yes, please.
So my question just relates to the enforceability of the provisions that are set out here in the proposed local law. Are the staff confident that these provisions will be enforceable should they be appealed to SAT?
Ms Mabs, who would be best to answer that question? CEO?
My apologies. Could I ask for Elizabeth to respond to that?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Councillor Wilson, would you be able to repeat the question, please?
Yes, so the question just relates to the enforceability of these provisions. If a developer was aggrieved and sought to take the town to the State Administrative Tribunal, are staff confident that we would be able to have these provisions enforced and that it would survive an appeal at the State Administrative Tribunal?
With any piece of legislation, it is always, or it has to be tried and tested. So in this respect, I would say it would be on a case-by-case basis, depending on the clause that was being taken exception to, or that was taken to SAT or to another jurisdiction.
Thank you for that. Councillor Wilson, do you have any further questions?
No, thank you, Your Worship.
Okay, if there are no further questions, I'm happy to move the motion. Is there a seconder for the motion?
Sorry. No, I'm confused. I missed something when I went out of the room to use the bathroom.
Right, so on 10.9, the verge treatment policy.
Okay, so this is why I'm confused, because this isn't legislation, this is a policy. So I think the answer to the question might not. I'm not really clear on the intent of Councillor Wilson's question in terms of SAT and that needing to be legislation, because this is just a policy. Can someone explain the intent of the question and then the answer again, please?
So maybe Councillor Wilson, you can clarify, and then we can seek assistance.
Thank you, Your Worship. So just in relation to Councillor Quinton's question, so I guess my concern goes to whether the policy, if we adopt the policy as proposed, would we be able to enforce that in a meaningful way? And if a developer was to flout the policy and not comply with it, would we have a mechanism by which we could seek to have it enforced?
I'm also not entirely clear on what it is that you're seeking to understand. So when you say a developer flouting the policy, are you talking about removing verge trees and so on, or what is it specifically that you're referring to?
I guess it goes to the idea that if we're going to have a policy, it would be nice that we can enforce it, that it's not just a decorative guideline, but that it is something that carries weight. And so my question is, are we able to enforce this policy and have some recourse if somebody does not follow the policy?
Ms Mabs, are you able to make comment? I'm not sure if your microphone is on, Peter.
My apologies. The verge policy was really created in response to community interest in looking at alternate treatments on verges, particularly as blocks are getting smaller. So it is really a community-driven opportunity. There is some intersection with, things like the thoroughfares local law, particularly when we start talking about things like structures. But really, this was created in response to community demand, and it really provides a wonderful opportunity for the community to think differently about the verge space that they have. The opportunity is for local governments to positively reinforce this rather than take punitive action against individuals. And so if there are any issues from a legislative perspective, certainly the town would take action, but it would be more around education and working with the individual rather than seeking to take action through a formal legal framework. So it's a brand new policy, and it's one that we'd like to test and trial.
Thank you. So just to clarify, Councillor Wilson, do you mind? Yeah, thank you, Peter. So were you asking along the lines of if a developer was to install something on their verge that was a non-permitted treatment, for example, artificial turf or something along those lines, whether that would be enforceable? Was that where your question was coming from?
Yes, and look, it's in context of my full support for the intention of the policy. I'm just, I guess, wanting some clarification around, whether it's something to make us feel good or something that we can actually use to drive change. And I'm hopeful that it's something we can use to drive change, and that's why I'm asking.
Excellent, thank you. Councillor Quinton, did you have a question?
Yes, I have two questions. If we are going to be allowing people to plant fruit trees, particularly lemon and citrus trees, on their verges, and that tree then becomes the property of the town, how will people be able to manage gall wasp on those fruit trees, given the requirement? Will the council come out and prune that tree, or would someone just be able to do a 5-second job and cut that new limb off, sprouting off?
Is that a question for you, Mrs. Mabbs, or for Mr. Adams?
I think Mr. Adams would be best equipped to answer that. Thank you.
Thanks, Peter and Madam Mayor. Although we are encouraging residents to participate in the maintenance of the trees, the pruning is really going to be the responsibility of the town. Of course, I think these things will happen from time to time. You know, we don't want to be over the top about it, I don't think, but the town is, the way we're planning it is that we'll be maintaining responsibility for these trees.
Thank you. And you had another question, Councillor Quinton?
Yes, I do. Just following on from that then, because I did have another question about something else. Gall wasp mitigation is really something that if the homeowner can take carriage of and ownership over that tree, then that is a much better process and outcome for the homeowner and for the town, given that all it takes is to get your secateurs out, because they usually plant their nests on new shoots, and new shoots don't take that much to cut off. And wouldn't require someone from the gardens department to come down in their most convenient time just to cut off a new shoot when the homeowner can do that. So is this something that we need to work into the policy, or is this something that can be agreed by the town or by the rest of us in how to deal with something like this?
Mr. Adams?
Yes, thanks, Madam Mayor. Essentially, I agree with the councillor. It doesn't need to be in the policy, I don't think. It can make it into the guidelines where we can help residents, if they've got gall wasp, to manage it themselves. And, you know, we can take more of a leadership role in the management of the verge trees.
Thank you. Excellent. So my other question was, it was some feedback from a community member. She'd spent a lot of time and her own money doing up her verge, only for the telecommunications or water utility, or whichever one it was, came along and completely dug up her entire verge to get to the utility, to which point she wasn't compensated for it. So what would happen in that instance, given that someone has taken so much pride only for the utility to come along and destroy it?
Mr. Adams again, please.
Yeah, thanks, Madam Mayor. That is a curly one. The utilities are only obligated to reinstate what would normally be there, as in grass or concrete footpath or curbing. I do find that most utilities have sort of been changing their ways over the past few years. So it's definitely something that we need to challenge the utilities on, because I don't think it's really reasonable. I think it's to reinstate what's there, I think it is reasonable. But that's something that doesn't really exist in their thinking at the moment, and would be something for us to be challenged on
or for us to challenge them on.
Yeah, great. In that then, if this policy is approved tonight, would we be able to communicate some way with the utilities, should they come into the town, that we have this new policy, that we are encouraging people to take ownership of their verges, and to please be mindful that when they do that, I don't know if it's a letter to each of the utilities or something, but can we communicate that to these utilities? Particularly, I think there was a problem when the NBN was put in a lot of verges as well. That this is our new policy. Is there some way we can communicate that?
Yes, I think we can advocate to the utilities for that. How successful that would be, I suppose, up for debate. But that's something that that we could do, and we can form that part of our guidelines.
Thank you for that. Are there any other questions? Okay, so I'd already moved the officer recommendation. Is there someone who'd like to second that?
Yes, I'll second.
Councillor Quinton. Is there anybody against the motion? Okay, so that is carried unanimously. So moving now on to 10.11. This is the RFT for the town's plumbing and gas services. Any questions at this point? Okay, in that case, do we have a mover for the officer recommendation?
Yes, Councillor Quinton.
Thank you, Councillor Quinton. I'm happy to second it. Is there anybody against? Okay, so that is carried unanimously. So moving on to 10.12. This is the RFT for the Whitfield Safe Active Street. Any questions on this item? Mr. Adams, I had a question that I think you addressed in an email today. I was just wondering, given that there is a balance after we've had a look at the quoted cost, and my query was around whether there'd be the potential to use some of these funds to plant the additional trees that we've committed to along Whitfield Street this winter planting season.
Yes, thanks, Madam Mayor. I mean, the simple answer to that is yes, we can. There is as the report is written, there is a balance of funds when we compare the budget to the tendered price of about $200,000 excess. That is made up of line marking and other associated costs, but there will be some funds that should be able to go towards the planting of street trees. We just need the DOT's agreement with that, which we're confident that we'll get.
Great, thank you very much for that. Any other questions from councillors? Okay, we have a mover for the officer recommendation.
Yes, I'll move.
Councillor Quinton's moved. Seconder? Okay,
Yes, I'll
second.
move.
Thank you, Councillor McWilliam. Is there anybody against?
Yes, Your Worship.
You're against. You're always against this item. Is that correct?
I am. I do not wish to enter into debate on the matter, but I would like it noted my reasons for voting against that, which I'll put into the meeting chat.
Okay, thank you. So we have Councillor Wilson against, Councillor Quinton, Barty, McWilliam and McLennan for. So that is carried by an absolute majority. Ms Holmes, are you okay with following up with the reasons through the chat?
Yes, that's fine. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so item 10.15 is the council resolutions recommended for deletion. I believe Councillor Hamilton has a couple that she would like to bring out. Sorry, Councillor Hamilton has left the meeting. So in her absence, the two that she identified, just give me a moment, were in relation to Town Planning Scheme 4A. So this was ROC 19/69641. and there was a report that was to come back to council, which we haven't yet received. The other was in relation to the arts and cultural plan. So this was ROC 19/66206. So in Councillor Hamilton's absence, I'm happy to move the officer recommendation with those two items coming out so that she's able to address her concerns at a later date. Is there a seconder for that motion?
Yes, I'll second.
Thank you, Councillor Quinton. Is there anybody against? Okay, so that is carried unanimously. So, Ms Holmes, did you get those two items?
Yes, I did. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so that takes us on to 11.3, which was the notice of motion coming from myself in response to a community member's request for the town to support the UN Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. Are there any questions on that item?
I will second it. I'm assuming.
Thank you, Councillor. Sorry, just give me 2 seconds. Who was that just spoke? Councillor Quinton, sorry, I didn't hear you.
No, I just said that I second it.
Okay, thank you. Is there anybody against? Okay, so that is carried unanimously. Councillor Wilson's notice of motion now at 11.4 in relation to the use of the canteen at Stan Moses Pavilion. Councillor Wilson, I believe that you were planning on moving a deferral motion.
Yes, thank you, Your Worship. That's right. I do wish to ventilate all of these matters at a later time, but as a result of the coronavirus pandemic that has gripped our community, it is a moot issue. But the points that I seek to raise are still very much live, but can be dealt with at a later time. And for that reason, I'm happy to move a deferral to a subsequent council meeting.
So do we need a date for this to be deferred to?
If it's possible to leave it until further notice, then I'm happy to be flexible as to when that might be.
Ms Mabbs, is that acceptable?
Yes, that is acceptable. Thank you.
Okay, I'm happy to second that. Would you mind turning your... Yeah, thank you. So Councillor Wilson's moved the deferral. I've seconded. Is there anybody against? Okay, so that is carried unanimously. So now we'll go on to item 12, announcements of notice of motion for the next meeting. Is there any announcements by councillors? Okay, in that case, we'll move on to item 13, which is a confidential business. Do we have a mover to go behind closed doors?
So moved.
Councillor Wilson moved, seconded by myself. Is there anybody against? That is carried unanimously. Would staff mind switching off the live streaming and the maybe not the recording? Thank you. Can you indicate when that has been completed?
Your Worship, I just wanted to take a moment to congratulate the staff on their patience, flexibility and adaptability in ensuring the continuance of democracy in these challenging times, and thank them very much for ensuring that we had an ordinary council meeting in the first place.
Thank you, Chris. We are not quite finished yet.